morning we want to continue on in our study of Mark and just kind of continue from what we were talking about last week. And we saw this story last week about the temple and how Jesus was clearing out the temple. We just backed up just a tiny little bit and we talked about the story about the fig leaves and how Jesus was saying, look, really the worship that I desire in my house is not something that's just on the outwardly. It's not just something that we do on the external. It's not something that we just are worried about the process and the patterns of things that we do, but Jesus was more concerned about what was going on the inside. He said, hey, it's not the formalities that save you. It's not the legalistic things that save you. It's the grace by which we are saved. And so last week, Jesus makes an example of the fig leaves, and he says, look, just like how this fig leaf, this fig tree looks like it's supposed to on the outside. It has these green, lush leaves, and it looks exactly the way it's supposed to, but it bears no fruit. As disciples, as followers of Jesus, don't be like this fig leaf, where on the outside everything looks perfect, but on the inside we show no fruit. Because what Jesus is looking at is at the heart of the matter. He's looking at the insides of who we are. He's looking at the grace by which we depend on our salvation. And so Jesus is teaching the Pharisees, he's teaching the teachers of the law, he clears out the temple. Remember last week he goes and he finds the temple worship grounds and it's full of people and merchants selling different things, exchanging money. And so Jesus flips the tables, he tells people and he says, look, you're just doing these things out of formality because you come and you worship, but your lives don't look any different. And so Jesus is upset, he does all these things and he calls this place my house, you've made my temple a place of robbers and all these things. And so what happens naturally as we read on into our passage this morning is that there's these teachers, these elders, these people that are supposed to keep the temple guard. They're the authority figures. They come to Jesus and they say, Jesus, tell us by what authority do you do the things that you do? Who are you to come and clean out the temple when we, the leaders, the priests, the teachers of the law, when we say it's okay, who are you to come and tell us it's not and to do the things that we haven't told people to do? By what authority do you teach and by what authority do you do the things that you do? And so they come and they ask Jesus this question, like, show us some credentials. Who are you? How dare you do the things that you do? Now, the Pharisees have had problems with what Jesus was doing and saying all along, but when it comes to the temple, okay, when it comes to their specific jurisdiction, now, you know, in the history we've been talking a lot about this, right? It was the Levites, the priests, it was their responsibility to contain anything that was going on within the temple grounds. It's even to the point where the temple grounds had its own set of laws, okay, that was separate from the Roman laws. And so it's the gatekeepers, they are the people that are in charge of everything that happens. And so when Jesus starts messing with the things that are going on in the temple, now these Pharisees are really starting to get upset. Okay? This is a turning point where the Pharisees are really thinking, okay, not only are we going to try to disprove Jesus, but we want to arrest Jesus and kill him because now he's gone too far. He's come into our ground, our territory, and messing things up. Okay? So they're challenging Jesus. They think, Jesus, who are you? What authority? And it's interesting because Jesus answers that question with another question. He says, well, I'm going to ask you a question. And he gives him this trick question, okay? And he says, the baptism of John, whose authority is that? Was it from heaven or is it just by another human being? And the Pharisees are in a little bit of a pickle, okay? Because the people of Israel, people there truly believed still up until John that John was the very last prophet from God. And so if the Pharisees answering Jesus' question, if they were to say, oh, it's just by human beings, they were afraid of the crowd because they believed that John was a prophet of God. They were sent from heaven. And so when John was to baptize people, right, it was from heaven. And so they didn't answer this question, and Jesus says, neither will I tell you by what authority, but let me give you an example, and he tells a story of the tenants. Okay? He tells a story of the tenants. He tells this parable of the tenants, and he says, by this parable, I will explain to you where true authority lies. Where I find my claim, my credentials, where it is. Let me show you by telling you this story. And he gives him this example. And so for us this morning, what I want us to do is, as we think about what we talked about last week, about the formalities, about relying on God's grace, I want to kind of go on. If I think about it, the logical question is, okay, why should we believe in Jesus? Because why? It's easier for us to be in control of our own lives. So why do we need to surrender to God? Because essentially what God has been saying this whole time is, I am the ultimate authority. You must submit to my will, my command, my teachings. And so what I hope to try to uncover this morning is, as we look at this parable, is, hey, how does God want us to understand His authority, and how does that make a difference, and what does it look like in our own lives? Okay? The first point that we're going to look at as we start this morning is we're just going to lay the groundwork. And the first thing that we want to say is, it might seem obvious, but the first point is that God is the ultimate landlord, that He is the ultimate authority. Jesus demonstrates this in different ways. Okay? In Mark 11:17 and 24, it's interesting because He says small things, but they are very significant things. Okay? When He is cleaning out the temple, Jesus calls and He looks at the people that are in the temple and He says this, and He taught them, is it not written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations. He's referring to His house as the temple of God. The place where the people of Israel used to come and He say, this is the place of God. Jesus comes and He says, this is my home. Again in verse 24, Jesus answers and He's teaching to the disciples and He says, look, when you pray, ask for whatever you want in prayer. Believe you've received it and it will be given to you. Now you have to understand, in the cultural context of that time, who is the only person that answers prayer? The only person that can forgive sins, the only person that can heal the sick, it was God. And so for Jesus to say to His disciples and the people around them, to say, hey, ask for whatever you want. Okay? He's saying, I'm going to tell you, ask for whatever you want, and if you believe, you will receive it. And so naturally, what the people are saying is, wait, who does this guy think he is? And Jesus is saying by the things that He's saying, and then what we'll see is that, look, I am telling you, I'm trying to make it clear that I am the ultimate authority. I am the absolute landlord, that I reign over this place, that I am the king of where I have come, and you guys are the tenants. And it is very important that we understand this very simple but very strong foundational point, because if we don't understand the fact that everything we do starts that God is the ultimate authority, then everything that we do is skewed and is misunderstood. So I try to take an understanding of this, okay? So the parable that Jesus gives, He's talking about a tenant and a landlord, and Jesus is making the point, and He's saying, I'm the ultimate authority, you need to obey me, because everything belongs to me. In this temple, the rules, the world, this entire universe, it's mine, because why? God created it. Therefore, I have the authority. And so He's speaking in terms that the people can understand. He talks about the tenants and of the landlords. And so I tried to kind of contextualize this a little bit and think about what it means to be a tenant and a landlord, okay, in our society, right? A tenant-landlord relationship is based on what? It's based on a contract. Okay? A tenant makes a contract with a landlord, and a landlord makes a contract with a tenant. Okay? Here are some very basic contracts that you might see if you were signing a contract with a landlord or a tenant. Okay? On the part of the landlord, the contract that most landlords will sign is that they will make the property that the tenants will inhabit livable and clean and ready to live before the people move into. Okay? So if you're renting a house from a landlord, the landlord's responsibility is to make sure that house is habitable. It's livable for you. Okay? The second thing that most landlords will agree to is that they will pay and repair any of the normal wear and tear that happens to your house. Okay? So regular maintenance things. So say, after all the rain or the snow, your gutters are broken or things like that. It's not your responsibility, but it's the responsibility of the landlord to go and do the things that you do. To repair it, to replace it, to pay for different things. Okay? But here are most contracts that happen with the tenants. So when the landlord keeps up their part of the responsibility, what is the job of the tenant to do? To pay the rent on time. Okay? Use reasonable care and not damage property. And I saw that this is actually a big thing in a lot of the contracts that tenants and landlords have, is to dispose garbage properly. Because what happens when you don't throw out the garbage the right way you're supposed to? Meaning that you're supposed to take care of the recyclables, all that kind of stuff. If you don't do it, the landlord gets fined for that. Right? And so there are these agreements. Now, for us to understand tenant and landlord relationship It's always based on, okay, as long as the other party puts up with their contract, then I am legally bound with my contract. Okay? So as long as the landlord makes this place livable, as long as he's doing his part, I'm going to do my part. Okay? And so as long as the landlord is doing their part, we are contractually bound to do our part. Now let's transfer that in our understanding of who God is, in our contract. If we were to transfer this understanding, let's see what this is. Okay? Most of us, when we think about contract with God, and we become disciples of Jesus, and we become followers of Jesus, we make this claim of God. We say, God, I will do the things that you desire for me to do if you give me more blessings when I obey you. Okay? Less suffering and hardships when I become a Christian. And generally, good things are supposed to happen when I follow. Okay? This seems to be a lot of the attitudes when we talk to folks that become first Christians who say, okay, what do you think about in your life when you become a follower of Jesus? Well, they say, well, now that I'm with Jesus, now that I'm with God, now that I'm with the winning team, there's supposed to be good things that are supposed to happen. Every time I obey, good things are supposed to happen. And remember, this is something we talked about last week. The more I do my quiet times, the more I pray, the more blessings I'm supposed to receive. Because why? This is the expectation that we have of God. What is the expectation that God has for us as we see in the Scriptures? It's very simple. Love God with all our heart, mind, and soul, and to love our neighbors as ourselves. So this often is our understanding when it comes to God being the landlord and the tenant. God, I will do the things that you want me to do if you give me 1, 2, 3. And if at any moment we don't receive from you as the landlord, then it voids our part of the contract. But when we look at the Scriptures, what does it say in our relationship and how God makes a contract with us? God says, here is my terms. Here are my terms. As the authority figure, as the landlord, here's my terms. That I'm going to love you unconditionally, that I'm going to offer grace to people that are undeserved, and that I'm going to demonstrate all of this by sending you my son. He says, this is my part. And then he says to his tenants, my expectations from you don't change. Because I'm going to still ask you to love God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and to love others as you love yourself. The thing is, okay, for us, when we talk about authority and submitting to God and saying that God is the ultimate curator of all things, that God is the landlord, that everything belongs to God, there's often a resistance. And we see that in our Scriptures from the Pharisees as well, because they're saying, Jesus, how can you say that this is your house, that this is your temple, that you have the authority to grant the answer to prayers? How do you say these things? And oftentimes when we hear people speak to us, teach us to say that we need to submit to God, that we need to give God everything, because why? God owns everything. There's a lot of resistance that comes to that. Because one way or the other, it's like, God, are you really keeping up your part of the deal? Because as far as I see, my life isn't getting any better than it's supposed to be. Or we look at different things and we say, I don't really know if I feel comfortable about this understanding that God owns everything and I have no say. And I think especially in this country, the thing that comes into our realm of difficulties when it comes to accepting God's authority is this whole phrase that everything is mine, that we're entitled to things, that it belongs to me, and that what we offer to God is a little part of what we have. Let me give you an example of how this plays out. Okay? God says everything belongs to me. All of it belongs to me, and you are merely tenants. Let me challenge us in our understanding of what it means to come to church. Okay? For many young folks, and even, actually it doesn't matter what spectrum of life that you're on. Okay? For many folks that attend church, they'll say this: I go to church because it does God a favor. Because it makes God happy. Because God wants us to come to worship, and that's why I go. And one way or another, I want you to think about this, because even for myself, I will have to catch myself thinking that way, that the reason why I go to church is because I'm doing something good for God. But God challenges us, because what he says is, look, everything belongs to me. Okay? Everything is mine. Everything is here. It's not about you giving up your time. It's when we come to service, the attitude that God is saying is this is my time, and you're being a part of what I have to offer you. It's actually it behooves you to be here. It's not the other way around. Because why? The authority goes from God to us. And yet we resist it because why? We have this entitlement. No, God, this is mine, this is yours, and I will choose to give you what I desire. But here's the thing, brothers and sisters. When we resist God, what happens? When we resist God's authority, what happens? When we say, God, no, these things belong to me, those things belong to you, and I resist your authority, what happens? We see the first thing that happens in our scripture passage today, that we live in fear. Okay? When you resist the authority of God, you live in fear. Okay? It's interesting because look, and it's scattered throughout. Okay? Last week we talked about Jesus clearing the temple. Now look, after Jesus clears the temple and he teaches in verse 18 in chapter 11, the chief priests and the teachers of the law heard this and began looking for a way to kill Jesus. Okay? They're really furious and angry at Jesus claiming that this temple belongs to him. How dare he say that the house of God belongs to him, saying that he is the Son of God, right? They're looking for a way to kill him. But what does it say? But because they feared him, but they couldn't do anything because they feared him, because the whole crowd was amazed at his teaching. Again, when they come up to challenge Jesus' authority and Jesus asks them this question, they're thinking to themselves and they're like, wait, what answer am I going to give? And in verse 32 in chapter 11, he says, well, we can't really say anything because why? They feared the people, for everyone knew that John was a prophet. In chapter 12, in verse 12, at the end of our section, after Jesus gives this parable, the chief priests and the Pharisees, they're angry again because why? They're like, that example that Jesus gave, he's talking about us. And so they're really looking about a way to kill him, to arrest him. But look what it says again in verse 12. But they were afraid of the crowds, they left him alone. So what does resisting Jesus' authority have to do with our living our lives in fear? Okay? How do those two things connect? Why does, when you resist the authority of God, does your life start to be filled with fear? And it comes back down to this. Okay? It comes back down to this concept that things belong to me. That we have things that we say are mine. For example, my time, my money, my resources, my popularity, my energy, my services. It's when we start understanding things as it belongs to me, that's when fear starts to overtake. Look, what happens to the Pharisees? The reason the Pharisees are so afraid of the people and afraid of the crowd, and afraid of what other people are thinking, is because what does Jesus do? Jesus is challenging their authority and challenging their approval amongst the people. You see this? Wherever Jesus is going, wherever Jesus teaches, he says, don't be like the Pharisees, who say one thing but live another. And then he comes to the temple where the Pharisees have all full control, so they're fully aware of what's happening in the temple courts. That there are people selling and exploiting, and there's money changing, there are all these things happening. The chief priests know that these things are happening, and Jesus goes and he clears it out, and the people are amazed because they're like, well, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law said it's okay, but here comes this guy named Jesus and he clears it out and he gives them this teaching and he says, my house is supposed to be a place of prayer. And they're like, wow, this guy teaches and speaks like a miracle. And so the Pharisees aren't there because of any other reason, because of why? The crowd is listening to them and they're saying, wait a minute, I'm starting to lose my credibility, I'm starting to lose my authority, and I'm starting to lose my popularity amongst the people. But constantly what's happening, they're afraid of the crowd because why? They're afraid of losing something that they think and they perceive that they own and they hold on to. You see, brothers and sisters, when we start thinking this way, that it is my time that I give to God, it is my money that I give to God, it is my services or my popularity or my resources or my success, when we start thinking that things become mine, this is how fear starts to overtake, okay? So for example, let's say it's my money and I give some to God. What happens when we start thinking that? We start having fears of losing it. Because why? It's yours. It's mine. And if you give it away, you start losing it. Or, for example, another way we can think of it is that we just don't have enough of it. Because if it's mine, you're holding on to it, and every time you give it, you're like, I'm losing a little bit of what I have. And so each and every single time you hear anybody say, hey, there's a need here, there's a need here, and you hear people say, hey, can you give to the church, can you give generously, you're thinking, oh man, I have to give some of mine. And we're constantly gripping this fear. We're thinking about the number in our checking accounts, and we're saying, every single time I give, that number of mine starts to get smaller and smaller. What if I don't have enough? Let's talk about success. If it's about my success, my ambitions, then what's the natural fear? Our fear is of failing. Because it's all about me. It's all about you. It's all about our ability to succeed or not. And then it becomes, I'm going to fail. And everything we do is motivated, it's pushed by this drive not to fail. Because why? It's about my success. Let's talk about approval for those of us that struggle with this. Where what other people think, whether it's strangers or people that we really love, when it matters what other people think about us. Because why? It's about my self-esteem, it's about my popularity, it's about my place, my status in society, my approval of others. We live our lives always captivated by this fear of what other people might think of us. You know, I have a friend, I have many friends that struggle with this. And there's this one particular guy in undergrad who, for him, the approval of others is everything to him. It's his life and death matters for him. It's so strong that one time we were driving and he accidentally cut somebody off. Okay? Who hasn't cut somebody off while they were driving accidentally? Okay? Whether on purpose or intentionally, whatever it is, accidentally. He just literally didn't see the guy cut him off. And guess what happens? The guy behind him honked at him and gave him the finger. Okay? Honked at him, gave him the finger, and then just drove around. You know what? My friend was so bothered by this the entire day. He was thinking, should I have followed him and knocked on his window and say, I really didn't mean to do that to you, I'm sorry? Should I have done that? And the whole day you see it on his face, he's like, oh man, I wish I would have just followed him and just knocked on his window and said, I'm really sorry. Don't be mad at me, I'm not a bad guy. And I'm looking at him and I'm like, you're really talking like a freak right now. There's a problem with this. But you see what happens is when it becomes my approval that is to lose, then anything that happens, or constantly living in fear, it's like, oh, what's that other person thinking? If I dress the way that I dress, if I say the things that I say, or if I respond in a way that is unapproved, it's unpopular, then what's going to happen? Constantly living in a lot of fear. Let's talk about beauty, health, youthfulness, right? I mean, our society is saturated by it. It's overrun by it. You go to Korea, it's difficult to notice one person, differentiate one person from another because everyone kind of looks the same. At least that's how I feel. Okay? And it's not because of one thing or another, it's because everyone has the same kind of work done, right? Different work, right? Whether it's the eyes, the nose, the ears. I mean, these days you can't even tell some of the things that people get done. And you know, I went back last year and it's kind of scary because I'm walking by, I'm like, wow, everyone looks like models here in Korea. Even here, right? You watch movies and people make fun of people who have like Botox, right? Trying to remove their wrinkles to make themselves look youthful. Because it's why? It's my beauty that it's on the line. And we're constantly in fear of losing our youth. Is it any surprise our society is so wrapped up on stem cell research, on organ transplants, on things about making ourselves live longer, look younger? And when we see people who are in their 50s, actresses, actors are in their 50s and 60s, and they look like their 40s, we're like, wow, that person is really beautiful. And it's amazing because some folks I know, that they know the number of wrinkles that they have on their face. They'd be like, oh, that one's a new one. I'm like, you can tell that one's a new one? I'm like, yes. Because that wasn't there about a week ago. You see, when it becomes mine, right? When it becomes ours, when it becomes something that we have to lose, it's natural, and even the Pharisees, and Jesus is demonstrating it here, it's like, look, if you don't understand that everything belongs to me, the most fundamental thing, you're going to live your life in fear, because case in point, look at the Pharisees. It wasn't that anything else was happening. They were losing their approval. They were losing their credentials. They were losing their popularity from the people. And the reason why they wanted to kill Jesus, to arrest Jesus, is because what's belonging to them has been taken away. And so Jesus asks us this morning, as he gives this parable, he says, look, here's a landlord. He creates a vineyard, and he places a watchtower. Okay? He makes it safe, and then he puts tenants in there, and he says, look, farm the land. Live the way that you want. All I ask is when there's fruit, I want some of it back. And what happens? The story, it's kind of ridiculous, right? This landlord, he sends the servant to say, okay, you've been living here, you've been doing your thing for a while, now give me some of the things back so I can enjoy some of the fruits that I've rented to you. And what do? They kill the guy. Because why? It's threatening. It belongs to me, and now I have to give some of it up, and it's threatening. It was mine, and now somebody's coming and saying, I want some of that, and it's like, no, I want to give it to you. And if we don't understand that everything that we have, all authority, the whole basis of all that we've talked about is that it starts from God giving it to us as a place of grace, then all that we do starts to become skewed. But here's the beauty of this, okay? And here's the remarkable thing. How does God teach us through this parable? How does he teach us to be submissive? How does it teach us about God's authority? And the two most amazing things. The first thing, and I love this about this story, is that God does it through patience. Okay? God does it through patience. Ever wonder why, when you read this, if this isn't the first time you're reading this parable, ever wonder why, as a landlord, you would send more than one person? Think about this. Okay? I have a younger brother. Right? I have two other siblings, so I have a younger brother and a sister. Say, for example, my younger brother borrowed a toy from me or something like that. Okay? And so I call my sister and I'm like, hey, can you go get this toy from my brother because he's played with it for over an hour and I like it back. And I send my sister to my brother, and she comes back with a black eye, with because he beat her up. And drop kicked her in the face or whatever it says, got scratches all over her face. She comes back and says, oh my God, your mother picked me up. Okay, and then what do I do? I'm like, Mama, can you go? Or I'll be like, hey, can you try here, put on a face mask, here, put on some gloves, and then here, can you go? And why would you send somebody again? And it's not even something like they're killing folks, right? But what do we see? In verse 2, he sent a servant and they treat him badly, right? Sent him and beat him. And then in verse 4, he sent him again another servant. They struck him on the head and treated him shamefully. You know what in scriptures when it means that he treated him shamefully? It means that they molested him sexually. Okay? These people are coming back. And look, in verse 5, he sent still another. And this one they killed. Okay? And then he says he sent many others. Some of them they beat, others they killed. Why would you keep sending people back? And then this landlord says something that's totally inadvisable. In verse 6 he says, okay, I've sent about 10 people and these guys, they've beat them, killed them, did shameful things to him. And so here, I have a really good idea. Let me send my son. Ever had a bad investment advice? There it is, right there. For sure, they will respect my son. You see what Jesus is doing? He's in a snapshot showing us a glimpse of what the history of mankind is like. When God created the earth and he placed Adam and Eve here and told them to be fruitful, to multiply, to serve God, to honor God and all that they do, right? What do the people do? As soon as they have a chance where it becomes mine, right? What does the serpent do and say to Eve? You can be like God. You can have the authority. You can have the clarity. You can have the judgment and the wisdom to be able to tell between right and wrong. It can be yours. And so what happens? They take it. And so God, over and over again, sends prophets, sends teachers, sends forefathers, different people to teach. But what does the people of Israel do? They reject them, they murder them, they prosecute them, they stone them to death. Over and over and over again. And then God says, I have a brilliant idea. I will send my one and only Son. What does God do when we reject His authority? He doesn't say, okay, you've had your chance. You didn't listen to me, fine. You want to see my wrath? I'll give it to you. But God does it in a way of patience that is totally a mystery to us. It makes absolutely no sense to me, the patience of God. And you see, brothers and sisters, this is how God works. Because it is through the patience and through the love that God convinces us of His true authority. Because the authority of God is different from the authority of man, which is often taken, not earned. So Jesus, over and over again, God, over and over again, pours out His blessing, His patience, His providence, and He sends one after another, until He finally comes to His Son and says, I will send my Son. But here's the greatest message of all this morning. Is that there is unconditional love when God sends His Son to us. Because even in our parable, in the story today, what happens? When the landlord sends his son, his one and only son, what do the people do? They kill that son. They kill that son. And for most people, when we read this story, okay, we can tell what the ending should be. They had their chance. Jesus sent servants. The landlord sent servants, many servants, over and over again. And He says, I have one left. That's the story that we read in the parable. The landlord, he says, I have sent all my servants. I have one left. I have one person left, and that's my son, and I'm going to send him to you. And at the end of the story, what do we read? They killed that one son. Because they were like, let's kill him and we'll take all the inheritance that son desired. Okay? We'll become like the Son of God is essentially what they're saying. We'll be like God if we kill the heir. And so what do we expect when we read this? Okay? It's not up here, but look. Right? In verse 9 it says, what then will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and kill the tenants and give the vineyard to others. Right? Isn't that the expected outcome? Right? They've done everything. They killed the son. And so Jesus is saying, so what is the landlord going to do? He's going to come and he's going to kill everybody. Give it to some other folks. But look what he says in verse 10. Haven't you read the scriptures? The stone the builders rejected has become the capstone. The Lord has done this, and it is marvelous in your eyes. The word capstone can also mean cornerstone. You know what? This, if we truly understand what Jesus is saying, there is a contrast in what he's saying in verse 9 and verse 10. Because in verse 9 he's saying, what's the obvious ending to the story? That everyone is killed and that he brings in new people. And in verse 10 though, what does he say? But haven't you read the story? The stone that the builders rejected. In Psalm, David is talking about this, and the stone that he's talking about is this most important part of architecture. It is the cornerstone, it is the capstone. The cornerstone, often you'll see even in our architecture today, it's the corner slab that anchors down the house. And the reason why the cornerstone is so important is because the cornerstone, it aligns all the other stones that are going to be laid in the foundation. So if the cornerstone is crooked or if it's not on the right foundation, everything else that's built is going to be off center. Okay? So the cornerstone, it brings the two walls and is the most important part. And so what is Jesus saying? The obvious outcome is that God kills everybody and He brings in new people. But haven't you read? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. What is Jesus trying to say here? He's saying, regardless of how human beings treated the Son of God, what is God's plan? God's plan is to send His Son to die for us, and His grace will be undeterred by our actions. Do you see this? Regardless of what we do, God's plan will happen. It will be fulfilled. The stone that is rejected will become the cornerstone. And what does King David say? And isn't it marvelous in our eyes? Why is it marvelous? Because we reject the Son of God over and over again. We reject Him. We kill the very Son of Jesus. And we deserve, verse 9, we deserve God to come and wipe us out, to bring in new people, to say, you didn't deserve it, you had your chance, but you missed it. But what is the marvelous news in our eyes? That the stone, even that we rejected over and over again, because God desires for it, becomes the cornerstone. That regardless of our actions, Jesus will still die for you, for me, and Jesus will rise again. There is nothing you and I can do that will change that fact. There is nothing that you can do that will change the fact that Jesus died for me and you, and that He rose again for you. That is the good news. And you see, Jesus is trying to show this. He's trying to explain to them, because why? The next couple of chapters, He's going to go to the cross, He's going to demonstrate it, but He's trying to explain to us this passage. Saying, look, you guys reject my authority. You continue to claim that everything belongs to you. That it's all about what we deserve, what we have, the entitlement that we feel. And you live your entire lives in fear because of it. And I'm here to liberate you from your fear, to tell you not to put you in slavery, not to put you in bondage by saying, I'm God and you must obey me. But I'm here to liberate you from your fear, because why? Everything belongs to me. And it doesn't matter how many times you reject me, it doesn't matter how many times you hurt me, God's will be done. And if you understand that, just like King David says in Psalm 118, that Jesus quotes here, how marvelous would that be when we understand that there is nothing in our lives that can separate us from the love of Jesus. Brothers and sisters, the authority of God is not one earned through power, through force, through vengeance. The authority of God is one that is demonstrated through patience, through grace, and through unconditional love. And when we can recognize that, and we see that everything that we have belongs to the Lord, and that we have been given even more than we can ever imagine, then we live our lives liberated from fear, and we see the marvelous truth that regardless of who we were, regardless of our past, regardless of what we had done, the will of God, that the Son of Jesus will die for you and me, and that this Jesus will rise again from the dead, and that Jesus will come to face you and me once again to say, I love you, will not change. That is the authority that we submit to. And this morning, we will take part in communion. And brothers and sisters, this is the demonstration of God's love for us. This is the authority of God laid out for us on the table each month, for us to do in remembrance. To say, look, here I give to you. And for many of us who come to church each week with heavy hearts saying, God, do you even know what I did this past week? Do you even know what my life looked like? Do you even know what my past looks like? Jesus says, come, look. Because your sins, your past, your mistakes, your regrets are not big enough to overcome the will that I have for you in my life. The will of God will always be done. And that is the one that is true. Let's pray.